Thomas was a baker with a heart full of kindness and a head full of flour. He owned a cozy bakery in the heart of a bustling town. The aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air. Thomas was known for his delicious creations. He used the finest ingredients and poured love into every piece. People came from far and wide to taste his treats. But Thomas had one flaw. He was incredibly forgetful. Despite his forgetfulness, Thomas was a skilled baker. He had a knack for creating the perfect crust on a loaf of bread. His pastries were flaky and light. He could whip up a batch of cookies in a flash. Customers loved his warm smile and friendly demeanor. They often overlooked his forgetfulness. They knew that a trip to Thomas's bakery was a treat for the senses. Thomas would often misplace his measuring spoons or forget to set the timer. He would sometimes even forget what he was baking in the middle of a task. One time he put a loaf of bread in the oven and forgot about it until it was burnt to a crisp. His forgetfulness was a source of amusement for some and frustration for others. But Thomas always took it in stride. He knew that his heart was in the right place. His love for baking stemmed from his childhood. Thomas spent countless hours in the kitchen with his grandmother. She taught him the art of baking. He cherished those memories and carried on her legacy through his bakery. Thomas believed that baking was more than just following recipes. It was about creating something special, something that brought joy to people's lives. And that's what he strived to do every day. One sunny afternoon, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Blake entered the bakery. He had an air of importance about him. Mr. Blake was known for organizing the grandest events in town. He was planning his daughter's wedding. It was going to be the social event of the season. Mr. Blake was meticulous in his planning. He wanted everything to be perfect. Mr. Blake approached Thomas with a proposition. He wanted to commission a grand feast of pastries and bread for the wedding reception. He had heard whispers of Thomas's exceptional baking skills. He was impressed by the variety and quality of the treats on display. Mr. Blake was confident that Thomas was the right baker for the job. Thomas listened attentively, his eyes widening with each detail. A wedding feast. It was the biggest order he had ever received. He felt a surge of excitement. He imagined the tables laden with his creations. He pictured the smiles on the guests' faces as they savored each bite. It was an opportunity to showcase his skills to the entire town. Thomas couldn't refuse. "Mr. Blake, I would be honored to bake for your daughter's wedding," Thomas exclaimed, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "I promise you, it will be the most spectacular feast you have ever seen." Mr. Blake smiled, pleased with Thomas's eagerness. They discussed the details of the order. The date was set, and Thomas assured Mr. Blake that everything would be delivered on time. As Mr. Blake left the bakery, Thomas felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was his chance to prove himself as a baker. He was determined not to disappoint. The days leading up to the wedding were a flurry of activity. Thomas worked tirelessly, his mind abuzz with ideas. He wanted to create something truly special for the occasion. He experimented with new recipes. He sketched elaborate designs for his pastries. He even practiced his piping techniques until his hands ached. He started his days earlier than usual. Thomas would knead dough as the sun rose. He would meticulously measure ingredients. He would lose himself in the rhythm of baking. The aroma of butter, sugar, and yeast filled the bakery. It was a symphony of sweet scents. However, as the days turned into nights, Thomas's forgetfulness began to creep in. He would get sidetracked by customers' requests. He would misplace his notes. He would even forget to take breaks. Time slipped through his fingers like flour through a sieve. One evening, as the sun began to set, Thomas realized with a jolt that he had completely forgotten about the wedding feast. He had been so caught up in his daily routine that the big order had slipped his mind. Panic surged through him as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The wedding was just 2 days away. Panic seized Thomas. He had never felt so much pressure before. The weight of his promise to Mr. Blake pressed down on him. He knew he had to act quickly. Thomas decided to close the bakery early. He hung a sign on the door that read, "Closed for emergency baking." He worked through the night, fueled by strong coffee and sheer determination. The bakery became a whirlwind of flour, sugar, and frantic activity. Thomas raced against the clock, his hands moving with a speed he never knew he possessed. He kneaded dough until his arms ached. He whipped cream until it formed stiff peaks. He baked batch after batch of pastries, his oven working overtime. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. Thomas's movements became clumsier, his usually precise piping became shaky. The pastries, while still edible, lacked their usual finesse. The croissants were a tad misshapen, the cookies were slightly burnt, the cakes, while delicious, were not as elegantly decorated as he had envisioned. By the time dawn broke, Thomas had managed to produce a substantial amount of baked goods. However, it was clear that the order was incomplete. Many of the pastries were not up to his usual standards. Exhausted and defeated, Thomas knew he had no choice but to deliver what he had. He loaded the pastries onto trays with a heavy heart.